so much about grief and pain and self-hatred or whatever emotion you're going through is immeasurable. And that's why I think the world of our bodies is so useful in an eating disorder context, because there's infinitesimal amounts to measure yourself.
And welcome to this week's episode of the Uncovery podcast. My name is Maddie and I'm recovering from anorexia, and I talk about it on this podcast. And this is round 2 of recording this introduction, because the first time that I introduced it, it was incredibly loud, and that's not going to work. So here we are. This week's episode is incredible. This week's interviewee is an incredible person, Christopher East. His story is one that I was bowled over by when I first came across it, and when I was introduced to him by a mutual friend that we share. So after you listen to this episode, I would greatly encourage you to mosey on over to his YouTube channel and look at his content there, because he's truly an incredible speaker, communicator, and creator. And he's also just way too humble for how good he is. But I hope that you really enjoy this interview. It will be in 2 parts because it is a lengthy conversation. So we'll put it into 2 parts for you. In all things Maddie and Maddie World and recovery stuff is kind of status quo. It's a little bit maintain the robustness of the recovery that I currently have and just get on with life in a lot of ways. For the current moment, I've been in this place of sort of tap dancing along the edge of overwhelm with the things that I currently have going, and a lot of passion for some stuff that I'm in the process of creating, ideating, and wanting to launch later this year. And so when you figure out, like, I don't know, your life's purpose, or you come across this piece of you that you're like, this has to happen, this has to be shared, it's difficult to look away from, but it also isn't not work. Just because you're passionate about something, just because you love something, doesn't mean that it's not taxing. And for those of us that are very lucky in that we have either professions or side professions or whatever it is that we love so much, we've been sold, and I think we've sold ourselves, and I've definitely planted this seed within myself and kind of let it grow, which is this: you'll never work a day in your life if you love what you do, this kind of idea. And I just don't think that that's true anymore, because it is still taxing and you still do need to take breaks. And so I talked to my therapist about this last time, and the idea was basically the inability to actually take real rest. Because even on days where, days, right? It's not like people, I don't know, but like can take weeks and weeks at a time. If you own your own business, or you're like doing things and you're kind of doing it on your own, there's really no such thing as being able to turn all the way off. And I'm working on that actively to get some help so that that maybe can happen. But even on the days that you take off like an entire Sunday and you're like, I'm not going to do any work, and I still will make a list of my relaxing. So it will be like this self-care list of like, okay, well, I need to make sure that I get up and I do yoga and I meditate and I go for a walk, and then maybe I meditate again, and then I make sure that I like do skincare and do an extra face thing. And so you've ended up actually like creating a to-do list, and all of those things are great, right? Like, oh, read a book and listen to 2 podcasts or whatever it is, write in your journal. You've still created yourself a to-do list. So you've still created like make work for your relaxation. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. I do that all the time. But I'm saying that there could be some value in just saying like, this entire day is white space. I'm not going to think about anything ahead of time. I'm only going to wake up and do exactly as my body and mind feel. and just do that all day. And if that means that I lay on the couch all day watching Netflix or whatever, that's what that means. That it's a purely free to do nothing day or couple of days or whatever. And what that might do then is bring you to a level of relaxation that is your baseline. You're like, oh, I can relax all the way down to here. It doesn't mean I need to spend very much time there. Doesn't mean I need to spend all of my time there. Certainly not. But the fact that you know sort of what your bounds are for stimulation and for relaxation, I think that that's actually a really powerful exercise. So that's what I'm working on in the next, I don't know, the next couple of weeks that I'm in BC at the lake, which is a context in which I actually find myself more willing to do that. I'm going to experiment a little bit with that idea, because it's not something that I do very elegantly. So that's that. I'm going to create a little bite about another thing that's kind of been bouncing around my head that will take too much time in this intro to record. So maybe they'll come out back to back. Scheduling, what even is that anymore? We'll regroup on like the quality of scheduling of this podcast in season 3. But for now, we're just gonna do it when it feels inspired and when the time is available, and not stress too much about it. Look at that progress. Look at that progress. I would have had an absolute meltdown at the beginning of this podcast in 2021 if I missed a week release, or I don't even know, didn't edit something enough. Like, we have really come leaps and bounds in terms of not letting perfect get in the way of the good over on the Uncovery podcast. But before we dive into the episode, I am going to introduce you to my dear friend, Christopher East. Christopher is a small YouTube creator. He's not a small, he's a great YouTube creator. He's not, he gave me this bio. I'm taking out the word small. Christopher is a YouTube creator that transforms their hardship into content that helps others. They tackle many different subjects, but have a focus on trauma, depression, and addiction. Christopher has a passion for normalizing the conversation around mental health through his own vulnerable sharing of past experiences. His ultimate goal is to help others reach their own higher selves and recovery. Absolutely stellar. You're going to absolutely fall in love with this human. And so without further ado, Christopher East. Christopher East, welcome to the Uncovery podcast.
Maddie, it's good to be here.
Great to have you. Why don't you just right off the top tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you? What do you do?
Well, my name is Christopher East. In relationship to the conversation of like how Maddie and I got to know each other, and like kind of what I do is I'm a content creator as well. I run a YouTube channel called Eastbound. I talk about a variety of subjects. I'm kind of all over the place, to be truthful. I haven't talked too much about my own eating disorder on my channel for reasons I'm sure we'll get into, but I talk a lot about like mental health, depression, suicidality, addiction, stuff like that. Just talk about struggles that I've gone through in life and try to transform my hardship into content that might help others. So that's who I am and what I do.
Amazing. So kind of along those lines, you recently had a bit of hiatus from your channel, and we actually had planned to have this conversation probably about a year ago. And then we took a little hiatus between that conversation and finally sitting down today. Maybe you can talk a little bit about why those two things are kind of overlapping in the whys and the hows.
Yeah, so I've been a content creator. That's such a cringe thing to say, but I've been a content creator for 3 years, since January of 2020. But at the start of 2022, so a year and a half ago now, I ran away from my channel. I took a really long break. And a bit of that was because of a topic coming up that I wasn't ready to talk about, which is in my last relationship, there was a lot of elements of abuse and a lot of elements of why it was traumatic. And there are other elements of it I'm sure we're going to get into. But on top of that, there was elements of sexual abuse. And my sexual abuse is something that I've been running away from. And in relationship to what we're going to be talking about today, there's two periods of my eating disorder, because I've had an eating disorder for over 12 years. There's sort of the period before my ex-fiance, and then there's the period after my ex-fiance. And there really is no talking about the second period of my bulimia in particular without talking about my sexual abuse. And so I kind of reached this point in my own content, and then with even talking to you, where it's like I can't move forward without finally talking about this thing. And I wasn't ready to. There was just so much in my life that was still going on and still needed processing. And so, recently I've gotten into a really good place with it. And so that's why I feel ready to do the podcast finally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. And we're very happy to have you. Um, the the eating disorder, you were open about it and having it for some time before that, and some events that it had brought into your life. And now that the whole scope of its sort of roots and causes and we'll call them accelerating factors in your life
Mm.
are out there, now maybe we can kind of go back and say, where did it all begin? Maybe you can tell me a little bit about phase one, as you refer to it, of your eating
Phase
disorder
one.
journey.
Yes. My eating disorder started as a result of the death of my father. My dad passed away right before my 17th birthday of a sudden heart attack. And so that was, I mean, losing a parent is a pretty traumatic thing. But there were contributing factors to why I personally felt very guilty about his death. Like a part of it, and I'll tell this story as quickly as I can, is on the day he died, it was very obvious that he was having a heart attack in retrospect. But at the time, I was a very angsty kid and I was like mad at him for some reason. And so my very last interaction with my father, I just knew something was wrong, but I chose the pettiness of, being a teenager. And then I didn't tell him to go to the hospital, even though I kind of wanted to. And I didn't say, I love you. And then, like, the last interaction I had with him was really negative. And there's other things, but for a really long time, I blamed myself. And so originally, I developed binge eating disorder to try to cope with that. And then, with the course of, do you mind if I discuss numbers? Does that matter to you or not?
It's fine.
Okay. In the course of about a year, I gained over 100 pounds. And so it was a really transformative thing in my life because I went from being relatively pretty fit and all these other things to gaining a lot of weight really quickly. And so that's how it started. And then over the course of the years, it developed into something very different.
Wow. I mean, we talk a lot about like the roots of eating disorder behavior and how intrinsically tied trauma is to the development of those eating disorders. And did anyone during that period of time notice or reach out, or was there any inkling from anyone in your life that they knew what was going on or were concerned during that first phase, at least?
Man, during all of the phases, no
Mm.
one's ever really been concerned that I have an eating disorder. And then people certainly noticed that I gained weight, but part of the problem in a family dynamic, especially when someone like a father figure dies, is that everyone's handling it poorly. Like several of my other siblings gained a lot of weight as well. Um, and so it just kind of flies under the radar. And then the people that knew me, there's this really weird transition that we might talk about. But the people that knew me in high school, they knew my dad died. So everyone just assumed it had something to do with my dad dying, which it did. But they didn't really put two and two together that it was like, okay, it's developed into an eating disorder, like specifically binge eating disorder. So I don't know. No one was ever concerned or worried or asked questions. And I think just everyone assumed that I was just dealing with grief because I mean, it was, but to the extent to which it was unhealthy, I don't think anyone had an idea.
Right. Do you think that that's a common thing for people with binge eating disorder, that really it doesn't go as recognized as, for example, anorexia, because there just isn't this like stark weight loss in what we typically would codify as eating disorder look?
It's interesting. I think there's just so many reasons why people gain weight that it's really hard to attribute it to something like an eating disorder. When someone is emaciated, it's really hard to attribute it to anything else other than, like, I don't even know what it would, like, chemo or
Yeah, yeah.
some
Like you're
kind of
either dying of
extreme.
something else or you're dying of
Yeah,
anorexia. Yeah.
exactly. Like it's really hard to be emaciated and for it to be anything normative. But there's plenty of people that are very large for very normative, non-disordered reasons. And so And that's the thing I think about a lot, is the body is a poor indicator of anything. So how do you
Mm,
look at someone's body and have any indication of what it's an embodiment of,
yeah.
right?
Yeah. And we'll talk about kind of the recovery journey and how that kind of comes into play there, I think. Um, but let's talk about maybe this intervening phase between phase one and phase two of the eating disorder. Was there a period of wellness or recovery, or did it kind of go right into sort of the relationship um, and that period of your life?
Oh, it's complicated. So after developing binge eating disorder, I had that for about a year and a half. And then a whole host of different issues happened at once. And I started to develop an eating disorder to cope with my binge eating disorder. So I experimented a lot. And some people don't like this, but I experimented. I tried out anorexia, I tried out extreme restriction. Didn't really suit me. I didn't really like it. I was typically
Yeah,
bulimic.
it's genuinely terrible. Yeah, would not recommend.
Yeah, well, part of the reason was, as I'll kind of go into, is like I tried typical bulimia. So I was typically bulimic for a while, but that made me feel too fucked up. It made me feel too disordered. I got to the point where I had an ulcer, I was throwing up blood. Like it was a pretty advanced bulimia for a while. And then I was like, okay, well, this is disordered. How do I keep on being just as destructive, but in a way that doesn't feel disordered, right? And so that's when I just developed exercise bulimia and a bit of what I call chemical bulimia. And so I swapped out traditional bulimia for absurd amount of exercise, like 3 to 4 to sometimes longer hours of exercise a day. And then I developed, like I said, chemical bulimia in the sense that I started taking like every fat burner known to man that I could get my hands on as a way to like also purge calories and accelerate that mechanism of weight loss through extreme exercise. And so there's a progressive period of that, of taking more and more dangerous and more slightly illegal chemicals to lose weight as quickly as possible. And a big part of that was, if I can kind of divert the conversation a little bit, is that for me, like the death of my father, that's death or grief in general is a really hard thing to conceptualize. But for me, I had gained this 100 pounds. And so what I did without realizing at the time is that 100 pounds was a way to measure the grief that was the death of my father. I had something tangible. It's like, okay, my dad died. I gained 100 pounds. That 100 pounds represents the pain and the grief of his loss and the guilt I have about certain things at the time. So now that I've had something to embody it in a way to measure it, I've gained something really special and I've gained agency, because now that I have this 100 pounds that represent his death, now I have something I can lose and feel like I'm doing something about that grief, feel like I'm doing something about that guilt. And so I set out to lose that weight as painfully as possible, as quickly as possible, because for me it was an act of retribution for the guilt and the ways I felt like I failed my father, and in some ways like self flagellation. I always mess that word up, but like a punishment of sorts. And so that was a really interesting component of my eating disorder the first time, was this embodiment that I did in trying to find agency through my eating disorder to do something about something I can't do. There is no doing anything about the death of my father. I just have to accept it. And so that was a really pivotal time, thinking and having hope that losing all this weight would somehow change the death of my dad. But of course it didn't, right? And then I just fell into other disordered behaviors. But that was a key idea. And so I started taking a really dangerous fat burner called DMP. And then that led to an overdose of this chemical. I nearly died. I went to multiple organ failure, was in a medically induced coma. My body nearly cooked itself to death. And so that was kind of the tail end, the very end point of phase one, was nearly dying and waking up in the hospital and being like, okay, maybe I don't want to do this anymore. And so that was the end of phase one.
Wow. So the first thing, as I kind of wanted to mention, is that it sounds like, because we think a lot about eating disorders being about a certain body shape or a certain physique or something like that. But for
Mhm.
you, it sounds like it was much more of a metaphorical representation of the weight of grief and actually
Mhm.
just trying to punish yourself to lose it. So was there any point in that first phase where you were thinking, I want to look a certain way, or was it purely punishment?
Uh, I wanted to look how I did before my dad died, right?
Mm.
But I find that this idea of like looking a certain way is ultimately just a justification for behaviors, right? Like it's never been in any of the phases. Sure, there was always a heavy fixation on what my body was going to look like, but that was never why I was doing it, right? It was just a justification for why it made sense to be doing the things I was doing is to get to that body. Or once again, like we're trying to measure something. So like whether it's starvation, whether it's bulimia, whether it's whatever, well, how do you know that what you're doing is having an effect? Well, we embody
Mm.
it through the physical changes that we're having, right? Because how else do we measure it? Because so much about grief and pain and self-hatred or whatever emotion you're going through is immeasurable. And that's why I think the world of our bodies is so useful in an eating disorder context, because there's infinitesimal amounts to measure yourself, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually that's brilliantly put. That it's the body is this representation and we need to put metrics to something that we can't measure, that we're just feeling. And so it gives us an outlet for I'm going to be able to attach to either the size I am, the numbers on the scale, numbers of calories, exercise, calories burnt, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's something to tether you to because
Yes.
everything else feels completely untethered. And I think that that's something that gets lost on people that haven't been through an eating disorder, is that this idea that it's about physique or that it's solely about thinness or something like that, when in reality it's about the entire emotional underpinning of the individual's human experience and
Yeah.
the way that they are trying desperately to cope with the misunderstanding that they're having within that experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more.
So this, okay, the near death experience that you had, that video that you talked about, that was actually the first piece of your content that I
Oh.
ever saw.
Mm,
And it was truly, truly shocking to me because I'd never seen something like that. And I had
mm.
never heard of somebody surviving something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about that story and that experience?
Yeah, so I was taking this chemical called DMP. It's technically like a fertilizer or an explosive or something crazy, something you should not be putting in your body. But basically, it's a poison. And the way it works is you take it and it dramatically increases your metabolism, but it increases everything that goes along with that. So you increases sweat production, increases your body heat, increases the amount of carbon dioxide that you're putting out. And so it's a really hellish drug to be on because you feel like you're in a heater the entire time. I remember I used to be a server and I would walk into our literal walk-in freezer and I would still be hot. That's how much like heat is pumping off of your body because it raises your metabolism by like 20, 30, 40%, depending how much you take. Now, the really scary thing about DMP is that there's no feedback system in the body. And so what I mean by that is that it's dose dependent. So the more you take, the more it has an effect, which sounds great until you overdose and your body starts to literally cook itself alive. Like your metabolism goes haywire, and that's how people die on this chemical. Is usually the body goes into multiple organ failure and cooks itself literally alive, and people die these really horrific deaths. And because, and then the worst part of it is like there's nothing they can do, right? There's no
Mm-hmm.
charcoal infusion, there's no pumping your stomach, there's no antidote, there's nothing, right? So once it gets in your system, it has to run its course. And for a lot of people, they just end up dying these horrific and quick deaths while family and doctors look on stunned because they don't know what's happening because it's a really rare drug.
Yeah.
It's not common use. And it really is something that someone should never ever take. And so, usually, by the time they know what's happening and what you're on, it's already too late. And so, out of everyone who's ever overdosed, there are only 3 people, including me, that I know of at this point that have survived an overdose. The rest have tragically passed. And that was one of the more moving things of creating that video was I had like 4 or 5 different sets of parents reach out to me about their son or daughter or their child passing away from a DMP overdose, and just how rare it is for people to survive.
Wow. Oh my gosh. And that's harrowing. And surely your family then afterwards and yourself afterwards would have had no choice probably but to say that, okay, there's something very, very serious going on. Obviously, we need to do something here now.
One would think that's what you would do, but that is not what happened.
Okay.
Yeah, well, because that's the thing is like people don't understand like your ability to truly suffer under an eating disorder. Like this drug was hell to be on, and I knew it was life threatening. I just didn't care. Right? It's the same thing that I saw with my ex fiance when she like starved herself nearly to death. Right? Like the your ability to suffer immensely for this goal, for this disorder, is truly a staggering thing to witness, both internally in my own experiences and as I've experienced later on in phase two, and as I've experienced externally through my ex fiance, what she did with anorexia. And so it was wild because it was just so painful and so difficult to be on, but like I was just so fixated on losing weight. And then I want to be careful about how I say this, but for someone who's bulimic, it's a really dangerous chemical to be on because I could binge thousands of calories a day, but be burning thousands of calories a day as well. And so it really, really enabled my binge eating in particular and made it a lot worse. But the thing is after my overdose, my family talked to me and they were like, okay, so why did this happen? And I wasn't ready to face the fact that maybe I had a disorder. The most I was willing to accept is like, maybe I have body dysmorphia, which I mean, I did, but it was a
Yeah,
lot
yeah.
More complicated
It's
than
not a
that.
lie. It's not untrue.
Yeah. And so everyone just thought I was stupid. And to be fair, I was stupid, but everyone thought it was on this accidental overdose, and it was accidental, right? I wasn't trying to end my life, but it was more than that. There was a reason why I kept taking more and more and more, and why I kept on flirting with this line, because I knew I was very careful about my dosing, and I was very careful about writing that line of when it was becoming dangerous. But because I got delirious, I double dosed on the same day, and that's how I overdosed. Because this chemical made me delirious, and I forgot if I had taken a dose or not, so I took a second dose the same day. But so my family talked to me, and I was just like, yeah, I overdid it, and I was just kind of stupid, and maybe I had body dysmorphia, and that was kind of it. It was one conversation, and then I was kind of left to my own devices after that. No one thought and the topic of eating disorder was never brought up. It was more along the lines of like a conversation you'd have with someone if they were taking steroids, right? It was
Yep.
more this,
Yep.
um, we're worried about the chemicals you're putting in your body because of like a bodybuilding angle. And it wasn't really that. It was more this eating disorder angle that was never brought up. And because I never had to contend with that, because no one ever pushed me on it, I was able to avoid confronting the fact that I did have an eating disorder.
Right. Right. Exactly. And so did that mean then that you were undeterred at least from continuing your eating disorder? That wasn't some kind of, I have this and I'm going to go into a recovery period or anything like that. What was sort of the next phase of that experience?
Well, die it's so funny because so many other things have happened in my life. So now that nearly dying is kind of like whatever in the grand scheme of my life, it's kind of a thing that I forget that happened. But to take myself to transport me myself back to that time period, it was truly an overwhelming feeling. I thought I was paralyzed when I woke up in the hospital. Like I couldn't move my body. My body cannibalized itself. It was so desperate for nutrition because my metabolism was 50% of what it should be, that it ate my own muscle. So I had to relearn how to walk. It took me forever before I ever could weightlift again or any of these things. So it was a truly traumatic experience, and it was a life changing experience. And so I would say my eating disorder went into remission. I wasn't in recovery because I was never choosing recovery. It was just like I nearly died. This was a really overwhelming experience. And I turned my life around leading up to that point. And one of the reasons why I hung on to my eating disorder so tightly is I had failed out of college. I was falling into the wrong crowd. I had no idea what I was doing with my life. And so the only thing of value in my life was my body. And I created an amazing body partially to do with the death of my father. And then it transitioned into like, well, this is the only amazing thing in my life. I've failed out of school. I have no career. I have no future. So I desperately clung to my body as tightly as I could, which then created this self-fulfilling or self-sustaining eating disorder because like I can't let go of my body. I can't let my body go away. And it's just like feeding more and more and taking more and more of this chemical, trying to get as perfect of a body as I can. But after that, I went back to school. I got went back to college. Like I really started grinding on life, and I felt very hopeful. And so for a while, I didn't really have a reason necessarily to be disordered because all of a sudden everything else was going right in my life. So my eating disorder was in remission, and all it was doing was waiting for a reason for it to exist again. Um, and that's why I wouldn't say I was in recovery. I was just in remission.
Right. Um, Lakshmi, my therapist, who you know as well, will often say, like, you can't just sit next to your eating disorder on a bench, right?
Yeah.
You can't just sit there and watch it and have it sit there or shrink it down to a little size and think that it won't grow. It will root and it will continue to grow and grow and grow until it finds another pathway in. And I think it's fascinating that in periods of good times within our lives, things seem to be going well because we don't need the eating disorder as badly, right?
Yeah.
We have other things in our life. It feels full. Perhaps our anxiety is lower. We feel more capable in ourselves. There's less uncertainty. There's less volatility. And so the eating disorder just makes less sense. Whether you
Mm,
have that as a recovery mindset or not, it just, you don't need that tool as readily available to you, but it's there. If you haven't eradicated it, it's just waiting for the littlest shakeup in foundation, or perhaps in your case, a particularly earthquake level one.
yeah, indeed.
So when was that?
Well, see, and then it's also kind of weird because I kind of wanted to get away from my body and my eating disorder. I didn't know it was my eating disorder, but I had this set of behaviors that were really destructive and I wanted to get away from it. But in the true sense of irony, cosmic irony, right? Like I couldn't make this up if I wanted to, but I had started dating someone before my overdose, and our on our 1 month anniversary was when I was closest to death. So that's how my ex fiance met my family. Was in the hospital, and the doctors being like, "We don't know what to do. He's probably going to pass away. You should probably say your goodbyes because there's nothing they could really do for me." Um, so that was on our 1 month anniversary of dating. We had been dating for a month, and so that event, combined with a bunch of other things in her life, she before I had met her, she was, or when I met her, she was in recovery from a really bad stint of anorexia. She didn't really talk to me about that. We didn't really get to that point. Like I kind of knew she maybe had an eating disorder, but I didn't know anything about eating disorders. That's a really big misconception that people have is that you can be in a horrific eating disorder and still have no fucking clue what an eating disorder is
Right.
or what it looks like. And then also, she was the exact opposite of me. I was always a binge eater and bulimic. And when I did try to be anorexic, I couldn't do it. And so she was predominantly anorexic. And so it was like a whole different world to me. And it didn't look anything like it did for me. And so we kind of talked about it, but I didn't really know. I didn't understand. I didn't know what her life was like. And so the stress of me nearly dying and her going to a new college and a bunch of other stuff that I can't really get into because it's her story, not mine. She relapsed into anorexia. And over the course of the next 2.5 years, I would watch her dwindle to the point where she nearly died from her eating disorder. And one of the big things that kicked it off was my nearly dying of my eating disorder. And so one of the weird things was it was immediate that she fell back into it. And it's weird because like no one's ever truly stereotypically an eating disorder, right? So she was predominantly anorexic, but she did all of the exercise bulimic things that I did.
Mm.
And so what was really weird is that as she fell more into the disorder, I became very ingrained into her disorder. So I was still doing all the disordered shit that I used to do, but this time it was like sort of against my will. And like my eating disorder kind of existed, kind of didn't exist. And it never really had a, I don't know, it's really strange to explain because like I was still doing all the disorder stuff. I was just doing it with my ex. And so,
Yeah.
but it wasn't really by my own volition, And a lot of times I was sort of I was forced into these really long runs. Like I was forced to push through a lot of pain and stuff because we got into all these fights if I didn't go running with her or if I didn't go to the gym with her and stuff like that. So, during this period of recovery or of remission, I was still extremely disordered, but it wasn't by my own choice, which was really weird and difficult and upsetting because I was trying to get away from those things, but somehow found myself tied back into them through someone else's disorder.
That must have been that must have been such a mental trip to not really have even fully recognized your own eating disorder, to start to really understand what hers would have been, and to have been caught in the wave of it as like a complete participant
Mm-hmm.
in like a team eating disorder, essentially.
Yeah.
How isolating was that? Like how kind of entwined was your relationship as a result? I would imagine that because of all the secrets and all of the ways that we need to keep our eating disorders alive, there's isolation in that when you're an
Mm-hmm.
individual with an eating disorder. But I've never known someone or met somebody that had that situation that you've described where it's them and their partner. Is that even more like you just have your one team member and then the rest of the world, we just shut it out because we're just doing eating disorder stuff?
Yeah, I mean, what didn't help is that we were both going to the same college together and we both lived in the same shitty tiny apartment together and we were both away from family. Both of our families lived in our hometowns. So we were isolated together in the same apartment. And then once again, I can't get into her story, but there are very clear and concise reasons why she had an eating disorder. And so, in the same way, it was hard for me to talk about my second round of eating disorder because I have to then talk about something like sexual abuse. Like it was the same thing for her. And so, there is no telling my family that my girlfriend or my fiance, whatever she was at the time, has an eating disorder, because then I have to talk about all the reasons that she has an eating disorder,
Mm-hmm.
her own trauma. And so it's that like domino effect, that chaining effect of like, I didn't tell my family that she was nearly dying. Like I didn't tell her. My family had no idea until she voluntarily admitted herself into a psychiatric ward. And that was the first time I kind of told my mom. But I was so isolated in that relationship, and it was so difficult because she would get so angry at me if I went to class or if I went to my job or if I tried to hang out with other friends. Because in her mind, I was leaving her alone with her abuser, which is her eating disorder. And so, and out of my own kind of codependency, I was also heavily ingrained into it. And I had a savior complex and I had all these really unhealthy and toxic ideas about what I was supposed to be. And so for that whole time, I was just so isolated in every single moment of that disorder. And then also I was placed in this position where I had to be the voice against the disorder. So for instance, a good example of this is like I had to have a mental tracking of every calorie she ate because she would do this thing where she'd ask me, "Can I eat today?" And then what she would do, if I didn't have an accurate of every single thing she ate or chew spit or put anywhere near her, she would get really mad at me. And she was like, "Well, you forgot half that package of tuna I ate. I can't trust you. Why would I listen to you?" And she'd get really mad at me. And so I also was around her all the time because I was like, okay, I need to have this mental inventory of what you're eating. So that way I could argue against your disorder because that's the role you keep putting me in. For anyone listening, I would suggest not being in that role. It's not healthy for either one of you. But so that's another aspect of why I was deeply ingrained is like I had to be such an active participant of the disorder in all capacities. It was as much my own disorder. She made it as much a thing for me as it was for her, as you possibly could externally, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Like and we know so much about how volatility in a relationship exacerbates eating disorders, period.
Mm-hmm.
And this is just, I can't imagine a more quintessential example of a vicious circle of like abuse and codependence and
Mm-hmm.
eating disorder. How long did it take for you to really realize how bad it had gotten during that period of time for you to be ready to leave eventually?
I don't think I ever really was ready to realize. And that's another thing is I can't really get too much into like the nature of the abuse, but like when your partner has a life-threatening eating disorder and you're watching them literally wither away in front of you, you will accept a lot of bullshit, right? Like you will accept, like you'll justify it. And to some extent, like this person is struggling and this person, and I knew the reasons why they were struggling, and they are very much what I call an empathetic abuser or a sympathetic abuser, right? Like it's really hard to hold them accountable when they are going through this life and death thing. And so you do this thing where you're like, okay, well, I'm gonna stockpile and hold back all these hurts that I have until you're ready to deal with them, because like right now you're in this life or death situation, and it's not the it's and to some extent it's not the right time to ask your partner
Right.
to stand up, right? It's not fair to expect certain behaviors of them when they can't even keep themselves alive, right? And like it's really hard because a lot of people have anorexia for different reasons. But towards the end, for her, this is very specific, but like she was choosing anorexia as death by anorexia. She wanted the
Ah,
most painful and slow way to die possible. And I honestly can't think of any way that's slower or more painful way to kill yourself. And so that's a very specific type of eating disorder and a very specific reason to have an eating disorder. And so I don't know, when those are the dynamics going on, it was really hard for me to ever hold her accountable.
mm,
And then the second she did get better, I kind of turned into an awful person because all this hurt and pain that was welled up suddenly came out in all this unhealthy ways and very angry ways. And I said a lot of horrific things and mean spirited things around that time as well. And I became a very destructive and toxic person. And I started getting in the way of her recovery
mm,
because I all of a sudden wanted her to pay up for all this pain she had caused. So honestly, I wasn't the one that left the relationship. She ended it, and I mean, I'm thankful she did. But I don't think, to answer your question, I never really realized, I never really reached a breaking point in of it myself because I just made excuses.
right. It is such an impossible balance, I think, for people that are with somebody or a family member of somebody with an eating disorder who's really lost the plot, right? Like there's sort of high functioning and we're getting by, or it's disordered eating, but it's not like a full-blown eating disorder. But
Mm-hmm.
but when you are in the weeds, like aggressive eating disorder, and you've lost the plot of your own life, your own wellness, the people who are watching that, I believe, try their best to separate you from the eating disorder
Mm-hmm.
when you are being a total unimaginable monster.
Yeah.
They're just like, it's not her, it's the eating disorder. It's not him, it's the eating disorder. It's not her, it's the eating disorder. Because otherwise, they would want so badly, I think, to throw their hands up and be like, absolutely, fuck you. I'm done. I cannot
Yeah.
watch this. You're not only are you killing yourself, but you're being mean while you're doing it. Like
Yeah.
it's impossible. And there's I don't know how to kind of tease this apart, but I get this feeling of, I know I have an eating disorder. Is that justification for me being monstrous to other people? Like,
Mm-hmm.
at what point are we like, yes, I get it, but also totally unacceptable behavior? Like, at
Mm-hmm.
what point do we stop accepting it? And I don't know that I have a good answer for that, but it's this impossible thing that I think about, where it doesn't give you the right to be an asshole just because you're suffering, but sometimes you cannot pull yourself to a point where you can even be a bearable human because you're
Yeah.
just so deep in it. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I don't know. It sounds impossible.
I don't know. You gave me chills because I have a video talking about this, of personifying her eating disorder and calling it creatively Anna.
Mm,
And it was like she was a different, you could walk, like I knew by her mannerisms, by the look in her eye, by the way she talked, like the way she held her body. Like I knew when she slipped into her eating disorder, right? And there was 6 months, 7 months where she was nothing but Anna, right? And to some degree it is so personified, the changes, and so tangible, all the differences. It does feel like your child or your significant other or your friend is possessed by
mm,
this thing, right? But at the end of the day, like you can't, like, it's not like this entity will ever pop out of this person and you can hold them accountable. Like, it always has to collapse back in on that person. And
Mm,
so my advice was just never personify an eating disorder. But like you're saying, how do we deal with those periods when someone does lose the plot and have lost their minds and have fallen totally in this thing, and then they're like a vicious animal to protect it, and they will say some pretty mean shit to get you to go away.
yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't know how you contend with those two, on in all seriousness.
Yeah, and I appreciate what you say about the personifying of it. It was something that throughout my recovery specifically, because usually this kind of idea doesn't come up so much until you're aware of the eating disorder and actually trying to combat it, that like, oh, let's separate this thing from myself as this entity. Let's get mad at Ed. Let's get mad at
Yeah.
Anna. I've never, ever, ever been able to mentally do that. It's never
Mm-hmm.
been something that has resonated with me. I'm always like, if it resonates with you, absolutely fantastic. If you're able to externalize it as a voice, as a entity, whatever it is, fantastic. If that allows you to have an adversary to actually
Mm-hmm.
fight against and that helps you, fantastic. It's never been a mental model that resonated with me because it felt so ingrained to who I am as a person. And I don't know if that's maybe a factor of maybe how long you've dealt with it or how long you've kind of been in the trenches where you can no longer discern which parts of you are the well ones
Mm-hmm.
and which parts of you are not. That's kind of how I've chalked it up myself. I don't know. It's probably much more complicated than that, but it's always for me been kind of like, this is just me. It's just like the other part of my brain that I don't like, or
Yeah.
that I don't like now that I used to like a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah. Okay. So after this incredible trauma, and I don't use that word lightly, right? Like when I think about, I usually refer to them as like small t trauma and big T trauma. And I
Yeah.
think that it's a word that societally we overuse, which
Mm-hmm.
ends up actually diluting the impact of the word for situations such as this, which are so clearly capital T trauma, that I don't want that word to be so overused, because I'm like, no, this is actually what we're talking about when we're talking about trauma. After that, how did this kind of like next phase of either eating disorder or recovery kind of continue on for you in the interim years?
Yeah, so the relationship was super traumatic, super abusive in a bunch of different ways. But when the relationship ended, I had so much self-hatred and so much self-disgust because of the variety of abuses that I was put through, that I was borderline suicidal. Well, not, I wasn't borderline suicidal. I was suicidal. I was deeply hurt and I was deeply depressed, and I was diagnosed with complex PTSD and all of these things. And but more so than anything was this like immeasurable self-hatred and self-disgust with myself. And that's when bulimia came to save the day again, to some extent, in the sense that, well, I'm so self-hating that I think I deserve to die. Or another way to conceptualize it is like, I thought I deserved better than myself, so much so that I'd rather die than keep being me. And so, like, how do you measure that self-hatred, or how do you vent that self-hatred into self-harm in a way that is like societally acceptable? Because like one
Mm,
thing is like, I witnessed my partner self-harm a lot in these very visible ways, and I hated that. And that's another core component about my eating disorder that we might get into, is that my eating disorder didn't exist to make itself known. My eating disorder exists to hide me as a successful individual. And it's like, well, how do I externally look as successful as possible? Well, a big part of that is to have an amazing body. And so once again, the thing that I'm trying to embody and measure, instead of the grief that is the death of my father, it's, well, how do I measure how much I hate myself and how much I'm self-harming and how much I have to punish myself today, right? And so for me, I turned to exercise again, exercise bulimia predominantly. And it's like, well, I hate myself enough that I have to run 10 miles today. Or I won't be happy with the amount I've hurt myself today unless I hit 2,000 calories burned, right? And all these progressive ways of measuring this thing of immense self hatred towards myself. And so that's how I fell back into exercise bulimia was, yeah, like I wanted to look a certain way, but looking a certain way was always a justification for this underlying thing that was, I call fitness my favorite form of self-harm. I think fitness is
Yes.
such a good form of self-harm because you can be societally celebrated for it. No one thinks the otherwise. People celebrate you and all this other things. And so for me, it was just self-harm, and measuring that self-harm that happened to result in a really amazing looking body.
Yeah. It's an exercise specifically is so insidious for that very reason. And because with anorexia, for example, it's really hard to think about it framed as like eating disorder behaviors. There's something very tangible about a binging behavior,
Mm-hmm.
a throwing up, purging behavior. When I used to talk in recovery or be in groups and we're talking about like eating disorder behaviors, I was like, restriction isn't a behavior, it's like a lifestyle. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a whole method of being. And
Yeah.
so these behaviors are really, really difficult to pin down. Exercise is a weird one because it is a very active, literally active behavior, but it's also such a praised one and such a
Mm-hmm.
celebrated one. And I would imagine in men specifically, because then you are not necessarily shrinking down to this like concerning level of thinness. You actually look like just the what we would quote unquote be calling like some kind of ideal or male ideal body shape.
Yeah.
How impossible to confront the fact that that's disordered when
Yeah.
it's the dream.
Yeah.
And I think that it goes unnoticed in men for that reason. I think men are less inclined to talk about it for that reason. But I would imagine that it's much more common than we probably know that
Yeah.
that's what's going on in these sort of like insane physiques that we see, especially online. So, was anybody at any point concerned about you overdoing it on the exercise in phase two?
People were worried I was taking steroids, which
Mm.
it's ironic because my eating disorder and my body dysmorphia protected me from steroids. Because I'm relatively short. I guess I'm average height, but I'm 5'8". And so for me, in the body dysmorphia sense, like aesthetics have always been like this super crippling fixation of mine, and this idea of like proportionality. And so one of the reasons I never got into steroids is because I'm just too short, right? Like I always got to this
Oh,
point where I felt disproportionately too big for my height. So it never made sense to take steroids because all that would do
oh,
is make me more unproportional. And I hated the idea of being unproportional just as much as my ex hated having any fat on her, right? Like that
right.
same disgust and distaste. And so in a weird way, that's the reason why I never took steroids. But people would be worried about that. Like people ask
Yeah.
me, oh, are you on chemicals? And I would just answer truthfully. It was like, no. And at the time, I didn't return to DMP. I didn't return to anything. I didn't even take supplements. I just worked out 3 to 4 to 5 hours nearly
Right. Yeah.
every
At a certain
single
point, you don't
day.
actually need any performance enhancing drugs. You're just
Yeah.
performing all the time. This idea that, like, the reason that I didn't get into steroids is that I thought about the disproportions of my body is like the most insane mind twisting statement
Mm-hmm.
about physique and aesthetic. And the disproportionate thing actually resonates hard, even though, like, primarily in my eating disorder, it's been a fixation on size and being thin. It was never about like numbers. I've never been aware. It was always about like how clothes fit and shrinking,
Mm-hmm.
but it was always sort of in pursuit of what level of thinness will make me start to look proportional, will
Mm-hmm.
make me start to feel like my ratios or like the way that my body looks in proportion to itself is quote unquote better, because I had had this idea in my head, which, yeah, we're still working on, that I'm like, well, I don't have a waist, or like my waist doesn't taper. And
Mm-hmm.
so in order for me to have a waist that is thin, the rest of me needs to basically be skeletal, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
just because like people are built different and we just have different bones and like whatever it is, like you can't change the size of your rib cage, but like you can destroy everything around it until it sort of looks like it's in the proportions you want. But by that point, you're so unwell that it doesn't even matter anymore. But that idea of proportions is still something that I struggle with when I think about like my own body dysmorphia, is that it has a lot to do with this is supposed to be in regards to this looking this shape and way for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, because like if you were to ask me what was the biggest difference between my eating disorder and my ex-fiance's eating disorder, other than the behaviors themselves, when we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about rationality, it's that I think men's body have what I call a lower bound, an area where once we hit, we freak the fuck out. Or at least for me, is like I have a lower bound where if I'm a certain level of like leanness or like just small in general, whether that's because of how much muscle I have, because of how lean I am, the way shirts fit, the way I look in certain lighting, I will have just as a dysmorphic and panic and disgusted reaction as my ex did, progressively getting lower and lower and lower, right? And
Mm.
that's the thing is like I think at least in the way I grew up, men with like one of the worst body types you could be, one of the most useless male body types that was perpetuated to me. And I'm not trying to perpetuate this
Mm-mm.
stereotype, but express what I was grew up around. One of the most useless was a thin, emaciated male, right? Because at least the bigger overweight dudes, they had utility in something like football, right? They
Mm-hmm.
still had value. But the most valueless body that I grew up around was that like emaciated. And so
Mm.
for me, the reason I never got emaciated or never got in these states that are stereotypically seen as eating disorder is because I had a lower bound. And I feel like a lot of other men have that lower bound. Whereas with my ex, like in a more stereotypical setting, what happens is that lower bound is 110 pounds. And then that lower bound is whatever. And then it's whatever. And then it's
Mm.
whatever. It's progressively getting lower. And then it's like, okay, my lower bound now becomes my upper bound. I'm going to freak out if I'm above whatever, right? It doesn't matter because it just keeps dropping. Whereas
Yeah.
me, there's a hard lower bound. And as I just described, there's a hard upper bound. If I'm too bulky or if I'm too overweight, I freak out once again. And so what I did as a male is I just ping ponged between the two. I would get really fixated on being as lean and having runner physique. Then I would get too close to the lower bound. And like all of a sudden, okay, we want to put on as much muscle as possible. I want to be really bulky, really strong. Up, hit my upper bound. Now it's time to, I want to be a rock climber. I want to be as thin and as light as possible so I could be good at rock climbing. So just ping ponging back and forth. And I just, the lower bound is what saved me, I guess, prevented me
Yeah.
from being stereotypical.
That is such a fascinating concept. And so I want to linger here for a second because I think then we've maybe identified yet another factor why men's eating disorders go largely less noticed.
Mm-hmm.
Because for women, as you mentioned, basically like the limit does not exist because
Yes.
the goalpost just keeps moving. We don't have this hard stop where like you can never be too rich or too thin kind of idea, right? Like
Yeah.
for women, they're like, there's no such thing. It's they'll take it all the way. And by the time they get down there, your brain has gone so scrambled that it actually seems rational to keep going in that direction. But this idea of like the lower bound and the upper bound means that there's this insane element of control to like stay
Mm.
within this place. And what it kind of reminds me of is this concept in bodybuilding and physique, which is this idea of like bulking and cutting,
Mm-hmm.
which is really just the ping ponging that you describe, which is the like, oh, we go up to here, oh, too much, okay, time to go on a cut, okay, time to go back up here, okay, time to go on a cut. And that's incredibly taxing on your physical system,
Mm-hmm.
but I think also on your mental system to be in constant check of where within this boundary am I currently falling, and how do I feel about that at any time.
Yeah. And
Okay.
it's really difficult because like right now, one of the things I struggle with is still body dysmorphia. And then like it's just it's so rapid because like right now I'll feel small and I'll feel overweight, and like clothes will fit a certain way. And because I wasn't big about the number on the scale because it was useless to me because I didn't have a because I did have a lower bound. So with me, it was a lot more body checking. How do I
Yep.
look in the mirror? How do I look in this lighting? How does this shirt fit? So on and so forth. A lot of body checking. But right now, I've slowly tried to get back into the gym. And so when I have a pump, I instantly fluctuate into like, I'm too bulky, I'm too big, I hate this body, I don't like it. And so there's never a middle ground for me. I either feel too small when I don't have any kind of pump or whatever. But the second I enter that space, it's like, whoa, I have a lot more muscle than I realized. Like, I really dislike this. I feel unproportional. And so it's a really weird headspace to exist in because, like, although this doesn't affect my choices day to day and it's a part of
Mm-hmm.
my disorder that I don't listen to, it doesn't mean it's still not screaming in the back of my head. I just ignore it. It's just like, well, I don't ever really like how my body looks because it's never perfectly in the middle. It's always either I'm too small or holy shit, I'm too bulky. And
Right.
it's frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. And so while it sounds like the behaviors have changed for you, maybe you can kind of walk me through how that came about, how you finally really chose or decided it's recovery time.
Mm-hmm. That just goes back to my suicidality. I really don't know how I'm still alive today. Like that's how intense it was and how serious it was. But I really struggled with how do I overcome suicide and how do I live? How do I find happiness? How do I not do this very extreme thing? Because despite how suicidal I was, like there is always going to be this innate part of human life that it wants to live. So there was this part of me that's like, okay, well, how do we figure this out? And I tried a lot of different things and it wasn't working. And the thing that worked for me, and I'm going to suggest this, I'm not suggesting this, this is very catered to me, was I made myself a promise.
Ooh, that was part one. You're gonna have to come back next week to find out what the promise was that Christopher made himself, and it's intense. So make sure that you make your way back here next week. In the meantime, if you want to hop over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and leave us a little rating and a review, I'd love you forever. I'd really appreciate it. Have a great week. We will see you on the next episode.